Well, welcome back to Module 2 of MUS 222, the History and Sociology of Rock Music. Today we're going to be exploring the 1950s Black music genres. Make sure you have your Module 2 notes out in front of you and follow along. Feel free to pause at any point in time to finish off some notes, and also make sure you pause and hit the links below the video here so that way you can listen as you go. In the years after World War II, America found itself in a state of peace and prosperity. Household items and consumer goods like refrigerators and televisions changed from being luxuries to becoming necessities in the household. Computers, although new at the time, were becoming faster and more portable. Electrical engineering made the introduction of the transistor radio possible. The Soviet Union sent Sputnik into orbit, and the world was ushered into this futuristic space age. One of the biggest changes in our society was the increasing dependence on automobiles. Shopping centers sprang up, interstate highways were built, and families took more and more road trips and vacations. Disneyland opened, as did the first Holiday Inn and the first McDonald's. Unfortunately, racism still existed with the 1954 Supreme Court case Brown versus the Board of Education, where it declares that separate but equal schools were not legal. This, of course, inflamed the racial tensions. Although the word teenager had been around since the 1940s, the 50s teenagers were different. These were the first in American history that didn't have to work to support their families. They began to develop their own cultural values, social arrangements, fashions, and awareness of the world around them. With their new class status and independence, adults sensed the teens were resisting authority. Adults pointed to the growing problems of juvenile delinquency, although statistically there was no increase over the previous years, and sexual permissiveness as the basis for their distress. Gospel emerged as a style in the early 1930s from the traditional spirituals. The man most responsible for commercializing gospel music was Thomas A. Dorsey, who is often called the father of gospel music. Ironically, before turning his attention to religious music, Dorsey was known as Georgia Tom, the blues piano playing half of the Hokum Brothers. Their hit recording, It's Tight Like That, from 1928, contained lewd, humorous lyrics. In the 30s, Dorsey started writing songs of good news and salvation with blues-influenced melodies and rhythms that eventually became popular at church services in the Black community. Among his many gospel standards are Take My Hand, Precious Lord, that was written in 1932. Gospel's influence on American popular music is immense. The melismatic singing of gospel can be heard throughout the entire history of rock music. Typically performing in church accompanied by large choirs, the male gospel quartets that started to become popular in the 30s were ancestors to the DoWop groups in the 1950s. Many of the early crossover R&B stars of the 1950s had gospel roots, including Little Richard and Sam Cooke. Gospel is also one of the foundational blocks of soul music, and its influence can be heard in the voice of the very first soul singer, Ray Charles, and in every 1960s soul singer from James Brown to Otis Redding and Aretha Franklin. When you come to class on Friday, we will watch the video on Thomas A. Dorsey and answer those video questions in your notes. Race music, which is later called R&B and blues, and hillbilly music, which is later known as country, were becoming increasingly popular among a growing, albeit segmented audience in the late 40s, early 50s. In spite of this, the major labels pretty much ignored these styles and their audiences as they had done since the 1920s, and they continued to promote their mainstream pop artists such as Patti Page, Perry Como, Rosemary Clooney, and Sinatra. During this same time period, a number of small independent record labels began to spring up, eager to find any kind of niche in the marketplace. R&B and country music fit the bill for many. In spite of the fact that by 1952 there were around 100 independents, their mark on the industry was still very small. Only 5 of the 163 singles that were million sellers during the period came from independent labels. On a rare occasion that an R&B or country record did break through and become a hit, the strategy that major labels often employed was to quickly record a cover. A cover is a version of by a pop singer who had a very broad commercial appeal. Covers were usually stripped of anything that might be considered offensive to any segment of the record buyers, such as any traces of ethnic vocal delivery or off-color lyrics, especially anything sexual. As a result, most covers ended up sounding very sanitized and sometimes even laughable. The poster child for this tactic could have been Pat Boone, whose watered-down covers of Fats Domino's Ain't That a Shame in 1955 and Little Richard's Tutti Frutti in 1956 both outsold the original versions. So be sure to pause right here, and I want you to listen to both examples, the Fats Domino's Ain't That a Shame and the Pat Boone's Ain't That a Shame. See if you can tell the difference between the black artist and the white artist that covered it. We will do more of this in our class on Friday. We'll be looking at the Tutti Frutti versions between the two. Covers were an effective strategy for the 1964 through 1954 period, and as a result, were an obstacle to commercial success for many R&B and country artists and their independent labels. However, once white teenagers started to demand the real thing, covers were no longer an effective marketing approach. Once the blues went electric, it was a natural progression to speed it up, put in a heavier beat, and make it more danceable. The term rhythm and blues was coined in 1949 and developed out of jazz and blues roots. As the swing era came to an end in 1946, rhythm and blues, with its boogie-woogie bass lines, increasingly replaced jazz as the music America wanted to dance to. Jazz veteran Lionel Hampton was one of the first R&B hits in 1942 with Flying Home. Be sure to pause and check out this song. On one end of the spectrum were the down and dirty blues bands that emerged from the urban blues of Chicago's South Side. The most prominent Chicago bar blues performers were Muddy Waters, Little Richard, Sonny Boy Williamson, Elmore James, John Lee Hooker, Willie Dixon, and Howlin' Wolf. These performers all recorded at Chess Records, where they were closely linked to the soon-to-emerge rock and roll styles of Bo Diddley and Chuck Berry. They were also highly influential in a number of rock bands in the 1960s, including the Rolling Stones and Cream. Jump bands, which usually included a small horn section along with the rhythm section and vocalists, played a smoother, more jazz-influenced type of R&B. Popular jump bands of this era included those of Johnny Otis, Louis Prima, and Louis Jordan. As the leader of the Timpani Five, Jordan scored an unbelievable 18 number 1 and 54 top 10 records on the R&B charts in the 1940s. Jordan sang songs that often contained street-smart humor. Jordan also made innovative short movies of the Timpani Five shown between featured films. And this is a predecessor to the contemporary music video. Again, be sure to hit that pause button and listen to a little bit of Jumpin' at the Jubilee. The king of R&B would be, of course, B.B. King. Rhythm and blues would become one of the most prevailing influences in popular music in the last half of the 20th century. When you come to class on Friday, we'll watch the American Roots music video, which will have more questions about the king of R&B, B.B. King. In terms of record sales, DoWop was the most popular black music in the 1950s. Its origins go back as far as the 1930s, influenced by male gospel quartets and commercial vocal groups. The Mills Brothers, who were in fact four brothers from Ohio, prided themselves in creating a tightly woven cross between jazz and barbershop vocal harmonies, with only guitar accompaniment. The Ink Spots were also influential to DoWop, featuring lead vocalist Bill Kinney singing in a melismatic, gospel-inspired high tenor voice that became a staple to DoWop. Both groups were immensely popular throughout the 30s and 40s. Take a minute and pause and listen to each one of these and see if one of them comes from maybe a very well-known movie that you might recognize. During the late 40s and early 50s, it became fashionable for amateur teenage vocal groups to perform an a cappella on street corners and on the stoops of apartment buildings, especially in New York. This was usually just for fun, although there was a possibility of being discovered. The first of these groups to hit it big was the Ravens, with their 1947 hit Write Me a Letter, and Old Man River, which sold 2 million copies. The bass singer sang the lead vocal, which was very unusual at the time. This technique was to become one of the signature characteristics of the doo-wop genre. The Ravens also featured choreography in their shows, another first that was to become a staple in acts such as the Temptations and the Supremes. Other groups started to copy these innovations. The Orioles' first pop hit was It's Too Soon to Know, which hit the top 20 in 1948. The song's huge crossover appeal was unprecedented for a race record and helped the group become regulars on the R&B charts over the next few years. Take a second and listen to these songs. With the success of the Orioles and the Ravens, other bird groups appeared, including the Penguins, Flamingos, and Swallows. Later, car names became very popular, with the Cadillacs, the T-Birds, Fleetwoods, and Imperials, just to name a few. Another doo-wop group that achieved notoriety of sorts was Hank Ballard and the Midnighters. In 1954, they had a series of Annie records, Work With Me Annie, Annie Had a Baby, and Annie's Aunt Fanny, that sold over 1 million copies each despite being widely banned from radio play. Each song contained sexually suggestive lyrics. The work in the first hit was a thinly disguised metaphor for sex and too risque for the 50s society. Pause here for a moment and hit the link below so you can listen to this song. Although doo-wop originated as an a cappella style, recordings were most often made using instrumental accompaniment, as record labels tried to maximize the commercial appeal of the records and make them more danceable. Many labels also took advantage of street singers who most often had no business skills and were just happy to get a record contract. The classic example of this type of exploitation is the story of Frankie Lemon and the Teenagers, who rose to fame in 1956 with Why Do Fools Fall in Love, which Lemon was only 13 years old. Producer George Goldman paid Lemon a stipend of $25, with the rest of his earnings going into a trust fund. When Lemon's voice changed a few years later and his career went into a decline, he discovered that there was, in fact, no trust fund. He turned to heroin and died from an overdose at the age of 26. Be sure to watch this video clip here so you can listen to Why Do Fools Fall in Love. Many other doo-wop groups were one-hit wonders, as bad business deals and competition of cover versions occurred. One of the best examples of the one-hit wonder was the Chords. So the Chords had their only hit, Shaboom, in 1953, which was quickly buried by the Crew Cuts cover. Take a moment, pause here, and listen to the two versions. You'll recognize Shaboom from the animated feature Cars. Then check out the Crew Cuts cover of Shaboom. See if you like the changes that are made or if you prefer the original. The most successful doo-wop group was the Platters, who between 1955 and 1960 had 18 top 40 hits, 4 of them going to #1. The Platters were not a typical doo-wop group, as they tended to use more complex jazz harmonies and stay away from rhythmic use of scat syllables, usually employed by doo-wop groups. The style and crossover appeal of the Platters was an important link to the smoother, pop-oriented soul of the 1960s. Pause here and listen to a little bit of Great Pretender from the Platters. As rock entered the 1960s, doo-wop faded away. Although there were still a few hits left in the genre, like in 1963 with On Broadway, doo-wop's influence had remained, extending to such groups as Beach Boys, 1960s Motown artists, and 1990s groups like Boyz II Men. Be sure to pause here. Click the link of Voices of Doo-Wop. This is a video that you can watch and answer your video questions at home. We will not be watching this one in class. As rock and roll exploded during the 50s, major record labels started to take notice, although some in the industry were still uneasy with rock and roll due to what they considered too sexual, too vulgar, and very obscene. Many black R&B artists had started enjoying significant commercial success. In the early days of rock and roll, regional differences were an important part of the story. Studios in New Orleans and Chicago helped define the sound of those cities, creating the first crossover hits. Except for Elvis Presley, Fats Domino's sold more records than any other rock pioneer. Born in New Orleans, he was playing the piano in juke joints and honky-tonks in the city by the time he was just 10 years old. Domino's easygoing charm and demeanor made him likable and non-threatening to white audiences. The distinctive New Orleans R&B from the 50s had loose shuffle rhythms from jazz, tight bands from gospel, and a preference towards walking bass lines from boogie-woogie. His greatest hits came between 1955 and 1960, including Ain't That a Shame, I'm in Love Again, and Blueberry Hill. Be sure to pause here as you're finishing your notes, click the link for Blueberry Hill, and take a listen to it. Little Richard was in many respects the opposite of Fats Domino. He was very aggressive, in-your-face wild man who shrieked and hollered and pounded the piano. Growing up in a devout religious family, Richard learned to sing gospel music and play the piano in church. By 1951, he was performing on the radio with the Jump Band. In 1955, after sending in a demo, he recorded his first hit, Tutti Frutti. He often used stop time to punctuate the vocal parts and honking saxophone solos. His lyrics were among the most sexually suggestive of the era. On stage, he was wild and aggressive, standing up while playing the piano. He even took sexuality a step further, being the first rock performer to wear mascara, lipstick, and a pompadour hairstyle combed high. In 1957, at the height of his career, Richard left music to become an ordained minister. In 1964, Richard slowly began his return to music, but his greatest successes were behind him. Take a moment, pause here, and listen to Good Golly, Miss Molly. Meanwhile, up north in Chicago, a different sound emerged from Chess Records. Ellis McDaniel had moved to the city from Mississippi as a child and became a regular at the South Side clubs, calling himself Bo Diddley. In 1955, his first recording, Bo Diddley, went to #1 on the R&B charts. The song consisted almost entirely of one-chord vamp set to a repeating rhythm, which has since become known among musicians as the Bo Diddley rhythm. Of course, you can pause here and you can listen to it on the link below so you know what it sounds like. Bo Diddley was a distinctive persona, often wearing cowboy hats and these huge horn-rimmed glasses, and playing unusually rectangular-shaped guitars. Although he never achieved the fame of other 1950s crossover R&B artists, he was an important guitar innovator, linking T-Bone Walker and Jimi Hendrix. His use of reverb and tremolo to enhance the sound of his guitar was as pioneering for the 50s as the distortion and feedback that Hendrix used in the 1960s. He played his guitar like a percussion instrument, giving a very hypnotic rhythmic feel. His bands frequently included female musicians, which was very unusual for the time. Bo Diddley was one of several artists who recorded for Chess Records. Chess Records helped define the Chicago R&B sound that had a raunchy, powerful sound from Chicago blues. The instrumentation included distorted electric guitars, bass, drums, piano, and sometimes harmonica. Be sure to pause here and listen to a little bit of Maybelline. Chuck Berry was born in St. Louis and grew up listening to gospel, country, blues, R&B, and popular crooners such as Nat King Cole and Frank Sinatra. After becoming successful in a local club circuit, Berry went to Chicago in May of 1955 with hopes of making a record. After meeting Muddy Waters, Berry was referred to Leonard Chess and recorded Berry's tune, Maybelline, and shot up the charts. Chuck Berry was the first great lyricist in rock and roll. His songs were interesting, humorous, and occasionally tackled deeper issues, as in the condemnation of racial injustice in Brown-Eyed Handsome Man. Berry combined elements of blues and country in his songs. And while this was a reflection of his early influences, it was also a calculated effort on his part to capture the widest crossover appeal. Berry was also a great rock guitarist, creating double-note lead lines that were among the most copied in rock. His signature duck walk also inspired musicians to put on a better show. In 1959, Barry ran into trouble while on tour in the Southwest. He brought back a 14-year-old Mexican Indian girl to St. Louis to work at his nightclub. After she was picked up on prostitution charges, police launched an investigation into Barry on charges of violating the Mann Act, which prohibits transporting minors across state lines for immoral purposes. After 2 blatantly racist trials, which the first was overturned, Barry was convicted in 1962, and he spent 2 years in federal prison. When Barry finally returned to music, the British invasion was underway, sweeping him and many other R&B artists out of the limelight. This is the end of our Module 2 lecture. Be sure that you are listening to the links as we go along, or make sure you go back through and you listen to each one of them so you're prepared for class. I'll see you on Friday.